An old woman was humiliated by snipers until she took the gun and taught everyone a lesson. The malicious laughter of the elite marksmen echoed across the luxurious shooting range as they watched the old lady try to hold a gun with trembling hands, never imagining that those same hands had eliminated more impossible targets than all of them combined would ever achieve. Grab your seat and get ready. You won't forget this. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Margaret Winters walked slowly across the parking lot of the Excelsior Shooting Club, her wrinkled hands firmly holding a worn leather bag. At 78 years old, her fragile silhouette seemed out of place among the luxury SUVs and sports cars that occupied the spaces reserved for members. Dressed in a simple outfit of wool pants and a faded sweater, she adjusted the gold-rimmed glasses on her nose and took a deep breath before crossing the double glass doors of the most exclusive establishment in Westchester County. The Excelsior Shooting Club wasn't just a place to practice target shooting. It was a social sanctuary for New York's elite executives, celebrities, and politicians seeking to escape the city's bustle. Members paid exorbitant annual fees for the privilege of firing state-of-the-art weapons in climate-controlled environments, and then enjoying rare whiskey in the private lounge. Margaret approached the reception desk, where a young woman in an impeccable blazer looked at her with barely disguised suspicion. "May I help you, ma'am?" asked the receptionist, her tone clearly indicating she doubted the elderly woman could belong in such an environment. "Yes, dear," Margaret replied in a soft voice. "I'm here for the initial shooting class. My grandson gave me a voucher as a gift." The receptionist raised a perfectly outlined eyebrow. "A voucher? Are we sure it's for this club?" Margaret was reluctantly led to the main shooting hall, where a group of 9 middle-aged men, all wearing expensive tactical clothing, awaited the start of the special advanced training session. The instructor, David Keller, a former military man with broad shoulders and a square jaw, frowned when he saw the elderly woman approaching. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, clearing his throat. "This is a special session for advanced shooters. The beginner's class is tomorrow." "Oh," Margaret replied, blinking behind her glasses. "But the voucher my grandson bought said it was for today. He saved so much to give me this gift." One of the men in the group let out a muffled laugh. It was Richard Thornton, CEO of a technology company and a board member of the club. "David, let her stay. We can give her some basic tips before we start with the serious training." His condescending tone didn't go unnoticed. Other members of the group exchanged amused glances as Margaret placed her bag on a bench and smiled gratefully. "Thank you very much, gentlemen. I promise not to get in the way." The training began with a demonstration of shooting at 50 meters. The men exhibited their skills with enthusiasm, hitting most targets with reasonable precision. Richard Thornton showed the most confidence, explaining aloud the techniques he used while firing. "It's all about breath control and posture," he proclaimed, hitting the target in the outer circle. Of course, years of experience also count. When it was Margaret's turn, muffled laughter circulated through the group. David, the instructor, hesitated before handing her a compact pistol. "This is lighter, ma'am. Perhaps you'd like to start with something more manageable." Margaret accepted the gun with slightly trembling hands. "Thank you, young man. That's very kind." As she positioned herself at the firing line, Margaret's posture was visibly awkward. Holding the pistol with both hands, she closed one eye and fired. The shot hit the outer edge of the target, provoking barely contained laughter. "Not bad for a first attempt," said the instructor, clearly underestimating the elderly woman. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret's humiliation only intensified. The group moved on to precision rifles, and the comments became increasingly open. "Be careful not to hurt your shoulder, Granny," laughed one of the men when Margaret received a rifle. "The recoil can be treacherous." Another suggested that perhaps she'd prefer taking pictures of her grandchildren rather than firing weapons. Richard Thornton, now completely at ease with his perceived superiority, offered to show how it's really done before Margaret could try. "Watch and learn," he announced to the group. "This is a shot I learned from a Special Forces sniper." His shot hit near the center of the target at 200 meters, eliciting applause from his colleagues. "I think we shouldn't expect Mrs. Winters to attempt this distance," he commented, smiling at Margaret. "Perhaps we could move the target closer, say to 20 meters. The laughter that followed made Margaret's cheeks flush, but she maintained a polite smile. "Actually," she said softly, "I would like to try." "Are you sure, ma'am?" asked David, clearly uncomfortable. "These rifles have considerable recoil." "Absolutely," replied Margaret. "If I could just try once, I'll be satisfied." Reluctantly, the instructor handed the rifle to Margaret and positioned himself behind her, ready to intervene if she lost her balance. To everyone's surprise, Margaret adjusted her posture, planted her feet firmly, and held the weapon with sudden confidence. Before firing, she removed her glasses and put them in her pocket. Her eyes, previously magnified by the lenses, revealed themselves to be surprisingly sharp and focused. A silence fell over the group as they observed the subtle transformation. Margaret took a deep breath, partially exhaled, and pulled the trigger. The shot hit the inner circle of the target, not perfectly central, but considerably better than many of the shooters present. The silence continued for a few seconds before Richard broke the spell. "Beginner's luck," he declared, but his voice betrayed a hint of disconcertment. "Perhaps," agreed Margaret with humility. "May I try once more?" David nodded, now intrigued. Margaret's second shot hit even closer to the center, provoking murmurs among the men. "Impressive, Mrs. Winters," commented David, studying her with renewed interest. "Have you shot before?" "Oh, it was a long time ago," she replied vaguely. "When you reach my age, you've tried a bit of everything." The session continued, now with the men observing Margaret with growing curiosity. She continued shooting with surprising precision, although deliberately maintaining some errors to not draw too much attention. Richard Thornton, however, seemed determined to regain control of the situation. During the coffee break, he approached the group with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Gentlemen, to make things interesting, how about a little competition? The loser buys drinks at the bar afterward." His eyes fixed on Margaret. "You're also invited to participate, of course. No pressure." The competition was quickly organized. 3 shots with a precision rifle at 300 meters. Cumulative score. The men took turns, each demonstrating considerable skill. Richard particularly was in excellent form, hitting near the center in all his shots. 92 points, announced David, checking Richard's target through binoculars. Excellent performance. When it was Margaret's turn, a tense silence dominated the environment. Some of the men seemed genuinely curious about her performance, while others, including Richard, maintained condescending smiles. "No rush, Mrs. Winters," said David, now treating her with cautious respect. "Breathe and take your time." Margaret nodded and positioned herself. To everyone's surprise, she adjusted the rifle's sight with evident technical knowledge, checked the wind direction by observing the distant trees, and assumed a posture that any professional shooter would recognize as impeccable. Her 3 shots were fired in methodical sequence, each accompanied by the absolute silence of the group. 96 points, announced David after checking the target, unable to hide the amazement in his voice. "Mrs. Winters wins the competition." Richard's face visibly flushed. "That's not possible," he protested. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," confirmed David, handing the binoculars to Richard. "See for yourself." The other men looked at each other, some impressed, others suspicious. Margaret simply smiled and returned the rifle to David with a polite thank you. "If I may," said Richard, trying to regain his composure, "I suggest a second round, this time with a greater challenge." He pointed to a series of small, moving targets used in advanced training. Moving targets at different distances. This will separate the amateurs from the professionals. His gaze fixed on Margaret, with explicit challenge. She hesitated momentarily before nodding. "Sounds fun," she replied, "although I must admit my eyesight isn't what it used to be." The second competition proved even more impressive. The moving targets, operated by remote control, moved in unpredictable patterns at distances from 100 to 400 meters. Even the most skilled in the group had difficulties, including Richard, who hit only 4 of the 10 designated targets. When it was Margaret's turn, she asked to use her own pair of glasses instead of the previous ones. "For variable distances," she explained. The transformation was immediate and impossible to ignore. With almost supernatural precision, Margaret hit 9 of the 10 targets, including the most distant and fastest that no one else had managed to hit. The silence that followed was absolute. "Who the hell are you?" finally asked one of the men, verbalizing what everyone was thinking. Margaret smiled. "Just an old lady who appreciates a good challenge now and then." Richard Thornton couldn't hide his frustration and suspicion. Approaching Margaret, he spoke in an accusatory tone. "I don't believe in coincidences of that caliber, ma'am. If that's really your name, I demand to know who sent you here. Is this some kind of secret evaluation? A hidden camera?" Margaret sighed, looking at the group that now surrounded her with expressions ranging from admiration to suspicion. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "I have no hidden agenda. I genuinely came to learn. although I must admit I may have underestimated my own abilities. Impossible, insisted Richard. Nobody reaches that level without extensive training, professional. David, the instructor, studied Margaret with growing intensity, as if trying to access some distant memory. Is your full name Margaret Winters? He suddenly asked. Margaret Eleanor Winters, she confirmed, although many years ago I was known simply as Man. David's face paled. My God, he murmured. It really is you. We studied your methods at the academy. He turned to the perplexed group. Gentlemen, we are in the presence of a legend. Margaret Winters was one of the first women to join the FBI's elite tactical shooter unit. She established records that remained unbeaten for decades. A murmur of disbelief ran through the group. Margaret remained impassive, although her eyes revealed a gleam of contained satisfaction. That was a long time ago, she said modestly. I retired more than 30 years ago. The Lady of Silence, continued David, still astonished, responsible for the Albany operation in 1977 and the hostage situation in Denver. Richard Thornton seemed simultaneously shocked and uncomfortable. This is ridiculous. She's just a shooter with more decorations and successful operations than you'll ever achieve in 3 lifetimes, David interrupted firmly. And you've spent the entire afternoon ridiculing her. The atmosphere in the club completely transformed. The men who had previously despised Margaret now approached her with reverential respect, asking questions about her career and achievements. Why didn't you say anything when we started to... Well, one of them tried to articulate, clearly embarrassed. Underestimate me? Completed Margaret with a gentle smile. Sometimes it's instructive to observe how people behave when they believe they have superiority. It reveals much about character. Her eyes met Richard's, who remained apart from the group, visibly embarrassed. Besides, she continued, I learned long ago that there is strategic power in being underestimated. It was a considerable advantage throughout my career. David excused himself and returned minutes later with an old book about the history of American Special Forces. He opened to a specific page and showed the group a black and white photograph of a young Margaret in uniform, holding a precision rifle, surrounded by an entirely male team. Lincoln Memorial, 1973, he explained. The first integrated tactical response team. Richard Thornton finally approached, visibly uncomfortable. Mrs. Winters, I owe you my sincere apologies for my behavior. It was unforgivably rude and arrogant. Margaret observed him for a moment, assessing his sincerity. You know, Mr. Thornton, in my career I faced countless men who believed my place wasn't among them. Some learned from their mistakes. Others remained trapped in their limited convictions. She made a significant pause. What determines a person's character is not making mistakes. We all make them. It's the ability to recognize them and grow from them. I would like to try to be in the first group, replied Richard with unprecedented humility. Margaret nodded. Then perhaps I could offer some tips on your shooting technique. Your breath control needs work. In the hours that followed, to everyone's amazement, Margaret conducted an improvised masterclass in precision shooting. With patience and knowledge accumulated over decades, she corrected postures, explained nuances about ballistics that even David didn't know, and shared carefully edited stories of her missions. The greatest shooter I ever worked with, she confessed, was a man who had started his life as a gardener. Nobody took him seriously at first. Calloused hands, no formal education, heavy accent, but he understood wind and patience like no one else. The men listened, absorbing not just the techniques, but also the implicit wisdom in her words. In our work, as in life, continued Margaret, it's not the expensive equipment or impressive titles that determine success. It's the humility to constantly learn, the discipline to practice tirelessly, and the wisdom to recognize that there is always someone from whom we can learn something valuable. Richard Thornton, particularly, seemed transformed by the experience. Under Margaret's guidance, his technique visibly improved in just one afternoon. At the end of the day, as the sun began to set beyond the club's windows, Margaret prepared to leave. The group insisted on accompanying her to the parking lot, where her modest presence contrasted even more dramatically with the ostentatious luxury around her. To general surprise, Margaret headed to a compact and simple vehicle, as unpretentious as her initial appearance had suggested. Don't you drive something more? Richard hesitated, searching for the right words. Ostentatious, suggested Margaret with a smile. I never saw the need. This takes me where I need to go. Consumes little fuel, and no one ever expects the owner to be able to hit a target at 800 meters. She turned to the assembled group. Gentlemen, It was a pleasure sharing this afternoon with you. I hope you take with you not only the techniques we discussed, but also the understanding that character and skill rarely announce themselves with fanfare. David stepped forward, offering a card to Margaret. It would be an immense honor if you would consider returning for a formal session. Our members could learn so much. Margaret accepted the card with a smile. Perhaps I'll return. After all, retirement can be surprisingly monotonous at times. Before getting into the car, she turned one last time to Richard. Mr. Thornton, remember, in shooting, as in life, it is essential to keep your eyes not only on the target, but also on everything around you. The greatest threats and the greatest opportunities often come from where we least expect. With those words, Margaret Winters entered her modest car and departed, leaving behind a group of men profoundly transformed by an encounter that none of them would ever forget. As she drove down the tree-lined road that left the exclusive club behind, a satisfied smile played on Margaret's lips. In her long career facing dangers and challenges, few victories had been as gratifying as teaching a group of arrogant men the most valuable of lessons. Never judge a book or a seemingly fragile elderly lady by its cover. If you've come this far and this story has touched your heart, I invite you to keep this faith alive with us by subscribing to the channel and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any stories that touch the soul. And if this story has moved you, give it a like so we can continue sharing more stories like this one, made with all our hearts. Until next time.